Abstract. Industrial organizational psychology has systematically neglected organized labor as both a research domain and practice arena for over a century. This oversight, ranging from benign neglect to active antipathy, has constrained the field's scientific understanding of workplace power dynamics, limited its contributions to worker well-being, and created persistent ethical tensions. This article examines the historical origins of the psychology-labor divide, tracing early practitioners' management-aligned positioning through contemporary patterns of mutual disengagement. We document how this separation has diminished psychology's theoretical sophistication regarding collective voice mechanisms, distributive justice, and organizational governance while simultaneously depriving labor organizations of evidence-based practice resources. Drawing on industrial relations scholarship and emerging collaborative models, we outline pathways toward productive engagement, including union partnership research, collective bargaining support, and worker-centered intervention design. Given intensifying workplace power asymmetries and democratic backsliding in employment relations, reconciliation between psychology and organized labor represents both a scientific imperative and ethical obligation. In 2019, public approval of labor unions in the United States reached its highest level in 5 decades, with 64% of Americans expressing favorable views, a figure that has remained elevated through subsequent surveys, McCarthy, 2022. Simultaneously, interest in unionization among workers under 35 surged to levels not seen since the 1970s, contributing to successful organizing drives at major corporations including Amazon, Starbucks, Apple, and Trader Joe's, Bacon, 2023. These developments signal a fundamental shift in American workplace relations, yet industrial organizational psychology has remained conspicuously absent from these conversations. This absence is neither new nor accidental. For most of its existence, psychology has maintained what scholars have characterized as a management perspective that positions unions as obstacles to effectiveness rather than legitimate stakeholder institutions, Barling et al. 1992. The field's flagship journals rarely publish union-focused research, graduate training programs typically exclude labor relations content, and practitioners overwhelmingly serve management interests in contexts where union considerations appear primarily as risks to mitigate rather than partnerships to cultivate, Lefkowitz, 2008. The practical and ethical stakes of this separation have grown acute. As income inequality reaches levels last seen during the Gilded Age and worker voice mechanisms atrophy across industries, psychology's silence on collective representation leaves the profession's commitments to employee well-being sounding hollow, Schwochow and Delaney, 2019. The field claims expertise in organizational justice, employee engagement, and workplace democracy, yet largely ignores the institutional structures through which workers have historically exercised voice and secured protections. This article makes that history explicit, examines its consequences, and charts pathways forward. We begin by mapping the psychology labor landscape, then analyze organizational and individual impacts of continued separation, present evidence-based approaches to productive engagement, and conclude with frameworks for building long-term collaborative capacity. Our goal is not to prescribe predetermined political positions but to challenge a profession that claims scientific objectivity to examine how its institutional blind spots have constrained both knowledge and impact. The psychology labor landscape. Defining the schism in historical context. The relationship between psychology and organized labor is best characterized as mutual estrangement with asymmetric origins. While labor organizations have occasionally expressed skepticism toward psychologists, viewing them as management consultants bearing scientific veneer, the primary driver of separation has been psychology's deliberate positioning within management structures, Hushcho et al. 1984. This positioning emerged during the field's formative period. Early industrial psychologists, seeking legitimacy and resources, aligned themselves with efficiency movements and scientific management advocates who explicitly opposed collective bargaining, Barretts, 1960. Hugo Münsterberg, often cited as a founding figure, consulted for companies implementing anti-union strategies. During the 1920s and 1930s, prominent psychologists provided testimony and expertise to undermine union organizing, framing collective action as economically irrational and psychologically primitive, Katzel and Austin, 1992. The post-World War II period solidified this orientation. As psychology professionalized and expanded into business schools, its theoretical models increasingly reflected unitarist assumptions, The notion that organizations function best when management and employees share unified interests, or Kaufman, 2008. Unions appeared in this framework primarily as third-party impediments or symptoms of management failure rather than as legitimate governance institutions addressing inherent employment relationship power asymmetries. Contemporary manifestations are subtler but pervasive. A content analysis of articles published in Journal of Applied Psychology, Personnel Psychology, and Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes between 2000 and 2020 found that fewer than 2% addressed unions or collective bargaining as primary topics, or Goddard, 2014, updated analysis by authors. When unions appear, they typically function as control variables or contextual moderators rather than phenomena of central theoretical interest. Graduate training reflects similar patterns. Surveys of IO psychology doctoral programs reveal that fewer than 15% include dedicated labor relations coursework, and most practitioners report receiving no formal preparation for union contexts, or Lohman, 2006. Prevalence, drivers, and contemporary distribution. Several reinforcing mechanisms sustain the IO psychology labor divide. Funding and client structures. IO psychology research and practice depend overwhelmingly on management-funded resources. Corporations fund academic research, hire practitioners, and provide data access, creating structural incentives to frame problems through management lenses, or Greenberg, 2010. Labor organizations, operating with substantially smaller budgets and lacking dedicated research infrastructure, rarely commission psychological research or retain IO practitioners. Epistemological orientations. Mainstream IO psychology emphasizes individual and small group levels of analysis, treating organizational structures as fixed contexts rather than contestable political arrangements, or Goddard, 2014. This microfocus obscures the collective dynamics, power relations, and institutional conflicts central to labor relations. Conversely, industrial relations scholarship, which centers these dynamics, has developed largely separate from psychological frameworks, creating disciplinary silos. Professional socialization and identity. IO psychologists develop professional identities as scientist practitioners serving organizational effectiveness, typically operationalized through management-defined metrics like productivity, retention, and profitability, or Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, 2018. This framing positions unions ambiguously, as potential efficiency impediments rather than as clients or as legitimate representatives of a constituency, or workers, whose well-being psychologists ostensibly value. Ideological and political contexts. The broader decline in union density, from 35% of American workers in the mid-1950s to approximately 10% today, has made labor relations seem less practically relevant to many IO psychologists, U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, 2023. Simultaneously, several decades of neoliberal economic policy have normalized management prerogatives and market logics that treat collective bargaining as economically distortionary, Obad and Bavy, 2008. These patterns vary internationally. European IO psychology, operating in contexts with stronger social partnership traditions and higher union density, shows modestly greater engagement with labor issues, though still limited relative to the prevalence of collective institutions, or de Vitter et al. 2007. Scandinavian researchers, for instance, have examined union impact on workplace learning and employee development, producing insights rarely replicated in North American literature, or Sverke and Goslinger, 2003. Organizational and individual consequences of the IO psychology labor divide. Organizational performance impacts. The separation between IO psychology and labor relations has constrained scientific understanding and practical effectiveness in several domains. Incomplete models of workplace voice. Contemporary IO psychology emphasizes individual voice mechanisms, suggestion systems, engagement surveys, open-door policies, while largely ignoring collective voice through union representation, Obad et al. 2010. Yet substantial evidence indicates these mechanisms function differently and address distinct needs. Research by Freeman and Medorf, 1984, though dated, established that unions provide monopoly face, wage bargaining power, and collective voice face, grievance procedures, due process protections. More recent scholarship confirms that individual voice mechanisms, while valuable for incremental improvements, rarely enable workers to challenge fundamental power asymmetries or raise high-stakes concerns without retaliation risk, Wilkinson et al. 2020. By ignoring collective voice, IO psychology produces intervention strategies that may inadvertently undermine worker power. Employee involvement programs, for instance, can enhance participation within management-defined boundaries while forestalling more substantive democratization, Goddard, 2004. Without theoretical frameworks that distinguish voice amplitude, how loudly workers can speak, content, or what they can speak about, and consequence, or whether speaking produces change, IO psychology offers incomplete guidance for organizations genuinely committed to workplace democracy. Myopic treatment of conflict. Mainstream IO psychology typically frames workplace conflict as dysfunctional, something to minimize through selection, training, or culture management, Drew and Gelfand, 2008. This perspective obscures that some conflicts reflect legitimate interest divergences, management prioritizing cost reduction versus workers prioritizing job security, shareholders seeking flexibility versus employees requiring schedule predictability. Labor relations scholarship recognizes these tensions as inherent to employment relationships, with collective bargaining providing institutionalized conflict resolution, Obard and Colvin, 2014. The consequences extend beyond theory. Organizations that suppress legitimate conflict, treating unionization threats as culture failures rather than as signals of unaddressed grievances, often intensify underlying problems. IO psychology's silence on constructive conflict institutionalization leaves practitioners ill-equipped to advise leadership on managing these dynamics productively. Limited understanding of power and justice. Though IO psychology extensively researches organizational justice, it rarely examines power as a fundamental shaping force, Cropenzano and Stein, 2009. Procedural justice interventions, for instance, typically focus on manager training or policy design, assuming management willingness to implement fair procedures. But when power asymmetries are severe, workers fear retaliation, lack alternative employment, or face surveillance, perceived justice may depend more on collective countervailing power than on management intentions, Bamberger et al. 2014. Quantified impacts are difficult to isolate but telling. A meta-analysis by Ducoliagos and LaRoche, 2003, examining union effects on productivity found small positive average effects in environments with cooperative labor relations but negative effects in adversarial contexts, suggesting that relationship quality, a domain where IO psychology could contribute, moderates union performance impact. Yet IO psychology has contributed minimally to understanding how to build high-quality labor management partnerships, ceding this terrain to industrial relations specialists. Individual well-being and worker impacts. For individual workers, IO psychology's neglect of labor institutions has meant limited access to evidence-based resources precisely where power asymmetries are most consequential. Job insecurity and precarity. Research consistently links union membership to reduced job insecurity perceptions and greater employment stability, Cheng and Chan, 2008. Unions buffer against arbitrary termination, provide due process mechanisms, and create collective protections that individual performance cannot guarantee. Yet IO psychology's job insecurity interventions focus almost exclusively on individual resilience, cognitive reframing, or management communication, strategies that place adjustment burden on workers while leaving structural precarity unaddressed, Schoss, 2017. During the COVID-19 pandemic, this gap became acute. Unionized workers in healthcare, education, and logistics secured superior personal protective equipment, hazard pay, and safety protocols through collective bargaining, Hertel-Fernandez et al. 2022. IO psychologists, meanwhile, published extensively on remote work adjustment and stress management but rarely engaged with how collective action shaped pandemic working conditions, a striking omission given the profession's stated commitment to worker well-being. Wage stagnation and inequality. Union membership is associated with wage premiums averaging 10 to 15% even after controlling for worker characteristics, with larger effects for women and workers of color, Ivans et al. 2017. Unions also compress wage inequality, reduce gender and racial pay gaps, and increase benefits access. These are precisely the economic security factors that IO psychology links to job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and mental health outcomes, Judge et al. 2010. Yet the field has largely ignored how collective bargaining functions as a well-being intervention. Compensation research in IO psychology focuses on pay-for-performance systems, incentive design, and equity theory applications, all individual or small group frameworks that assume management determines pay structures. The possibility that workers might collectively negotiate compensation receives minimal attention. Occupational health and safety. Unionized workplaces show substantially lower injury rates and greater regulatory compliance, partly because union safety representatives provide worker voice independent of management pressure to prioritize production over precaution. Ovile, 1991. IO psychology's safety research, while voluminous, rarely examines union safety representatives' role or how collective bargaining shapes safety climate, another instance where ignoring institutional context limits understanding. Beyond direct impacts, the IO psychology labor divide has reinforced a troubling pattern. The profession claims to serve employee interests while overwhelmingly partnering with the institutional actors, or management, whose interests sometimes conflict with workers. This raises fundamental questions about whose well-being IO psychology actually prioritizes when stakeholder interests diverge. Evidence-based organizational responses. Bridging the IO psychology labor divide requires moving beyond critique toward constructive engagement models. The following approaches draw on emerging best practices, interdisciplinary collaboration, and organizational examples demonstrating feasibility. Partnership research and co-production models. Rather than studying unions as external subjects, IO psychologists can collaborate with labor organizations as research partners, co-defining questions, and co-interpreting findings. Evidence foundation. Participatory action research in organizational settings demonstrates that stakeholder involvement improves intervention relevance, implementation fidelity, and sustained adoption. Shani and Parmore, 2013. When workers and unions participate in research design, studies address questions that matter to those experiencing workplace conditions rather than only to management or academic theoretical debates. Community-based participatory research in public health provides relevant models. Researchers partner with community organizations to ensure research benefits flow to participating populations. Israel et al. 2005. Effective approaches include joint research committees. Establish steering groups with labor and management representatives who collaboratively define research priorities, provide context interpretation, and guide dissemination. This ensures findings address practical concerns while maintaining scientific rigor. Worker-centered measurement development. Develop and validate scales, surveys, and assessment tools in consultation with workers and union representatives to capture constructs that matter to employees, not only those salient to management. Transparent data sharing. Provide research results to all stakeholders simultaneously, including workers and unions, rather than treating management as the sole client with proprietary access to findings. Capacity building. Train union representatives in research literacy and data interpretation, enabling them to engage findings critically and apply evidence to organizing and bargaining. Kaiser Permanente, the integrated healthcare system, established a labor management partnership in 1997 involving the coalition of Kaiser Permanente unions, representing approximately 85,000 workers. The partnership created joint research structures examining staffing models, workflow optimization, and employee well-being, with IO psychologists and industrial relations researchers collaborating as neutral facilitators. Cochran et al. 2009. Studies co-designed by labor and management representatives produced interventions that improved patient care quality while enhancing employee working conditions, outcomes unlikely if research served only management interests. The partnership's unit-based teams, groups of frontline workers and managers collaboratively solving local problems, were evaluated using jointly developed metrics covering both organizational performance and worker experience. Collective bargaining process support. IO psychologists possess expertise directly applicable to collective bargaining effectiveness, negotiation dynamics, communication strategies, conflict resolution, and decision-making under uncertainty. Applying this knowledge to support constructive labor relations represents natural professional extension. Evidence foundation. Negotiation research demonstrates that integrative bargaining, seeking mutually beneficial solutions rather than purely distributive win-lose outcomes, produces superior agreements and stronger ongoing relationships. Walton and McKersey, 1965. Updated by Kutcher Gershenfeld and Cocken, 2016. However, integrative bargaining requires trust, transparent information sharing, creative problem solving, and future orientation that adversarial labor relations undermine. Structured facilitation, interest-based bargaining training, and neutral process consultation can shift dynamics toward collaboration, of Friedman et al. 2006. Effective approaches include interest-based bargaining facilitation, train both labor and management teams in interest-based negotiation, helping parties identify underlying interests rather than only surface positions, generate options, and evaluate proposals against mutual gain criteria. Communication and trust-building interventions, design pre-negotiation relationship-building activities, establish ground rules that promote constructive dialogue, and facilitate difficult conversations when distrust or past conflicts create barriers. Data and analytics support for both parties, provide neutral analysis of compensation benchmarks, staffing requirements, or economic forecasts to both labor and management, reducing information asymmetries that fuel suspicion. Post-agreement implementation support, help design joint labor management committees, establish clear roles and communication channels, and develop conflict resolution procedures for interpreting contract language. The telecommunications company AT&T and the Communications Workers of America, or CWA, periodically engage neutral facilitators, sometimes including IO psychologists with labor relations expertise, to support contract negotiations. Rather than functioning as management consultants, these facilitators help both parties prepare for bargaining, surface creative options, and navigate impasses, or Dunlop and Zach, 1997. This neutral positioning allows practitioners to apply negotiation and group process expertise without compromising professional ethics by serving only management interests during inherently adversarial dynamics. Union organizing and democratic process enhancement. Workers deciding whether to unionize face complex decisions involving economic trade-offs, social dynamics, legal uncertainties, and identity considerations. IO psychology could contribute to more informed, high-quality decision-making processes. Evidence foundation. Organizational change research indicates that participation in change processes, having voice in decisions affecting one's work, predicts greater acceptance and commitment to outcomes. Choi, 2011. Applied to unionization decisions, this suggests workers benefit from structured opportunities to deliberate, access balanced information, and exercise genuine choice. Unfortunately, many organizing campaigns feature intense employer pressure, captive audience meetings, surveillance, and one-sided information provision that undermine informed decision-making. Logan, 2006. IO psychology's expertise in decision-making, group dynamics, and information processing could support high-quality processes without predetermining outcomes. This means facilitating informed choice, not advocating for particular decisions. Effective approaches include neutral decision-making support, provide workers with frameworks for evaluating organizing decisions, including identifying personal priorities, weighing evidence on both sides, and anticipating consequences, similar to decision aids used in medical contexts to support informed consent. Deliberative forums, facilitate structured conversations where workers can discuss unionization questions with peers, express concerns, and explore options without management or organizer pressure, analogous to citizens' assemblies used in democratic policy contexts. Survey and preference elicitation, conduct confidential assessments of worker priorities, concerns, and preferences regarding representation, providing aggregate data to inform collective decision-making while protecting individual privacy. Post-election transition support, if workers elect union representation, facilitate introductory meetings between newly certified unions and work groups, clarify roles and expectations, and establish communication norms to prevent misunderstandings. Few examples exist of IO psychologists providing this type of support, partly because legal constraints and polarized organizing contexts discourage neutral facilitation. However, some labor arbitrators and mediators, roles occasionally filled by IO psychologists, perform analogous functions during representation disputes, providing process expertise that serves all parties rather than only management. O'Colvin, 2013. Workplace democracy and employee governance structures. Beyond traditional collective bargaining, IO psychology could support emerging workplace democracy models including worker representation on corporate boards, employee ownership structures, and participatory governance systems. Evidence foundation. Comparative research across Europe demonstrates that co-termination systems, where workers elect representatives to corporate supervisory boards, correlate with longer-term strategic focus, greater investment in worker training, and more equitable distribution of productivity gains, or vitals. 2005. Employee ownership through stock ownership plans, ESOPs, or cooperatives is associated with higher organizational commitment, greater knowledge sharing, and improved firm survival rates, or Kim and Perotin, 2014. These structures create institutional voice mechanisms that complement or substitute for traditional unions. IO Psychology's expertise in team dynamics, leadership development, decision-making processes, and organizational design directly applies to making workplace democracy functional. Worker representatives need skills in interpreting financial information, understanding strategic options, and balancing constituency representation with fiduciary responsibility, all domains where IO psychology could contribute. Effective approaches include board-level worker representative training, develop curricula that prepare elected worker representatives for governance roles, covering corporate finance fundamentals, strategic decision-making, and effective board participation. Participatory structure design, help organizations design worker councils, joint committees, or other voice structures that enable meaningful input without creating unwieldy bureaucracy, including clarifying decision rights, information flows, and escalation procedures. Cultural and leadership development for shared governance, train managers to function effectively in environments where authority is shared with worker representatives, addressing psychological barriers to power sharing and developing facilitative leadership capabilities. Evaluation and continuous improvement, assess workplace democracy structures' effectiveness using jointly defined success metrics, identify implementation obstacles, and support iterative refinement. Mondragon Corporation, the Spanish Federation of Worker Cooperatives, employs psychologists and organizational development specialists to support cooperative governance. These professionals help newly elected worker-owner councils develop effective decision-making processes, facilitate conflicts between cooperative principles and market pressures, and design training for members assuming governance responsibilities, Cheney et al. 2014. While Mondragon operates in a distinct cultural and legal context, its integration of psychological expertise into democratic governance demonstrates feasibility. Similarly, the John Lewis Partnership in the United Kingdom, a major retailer with substantial employee ownership, employs organizational development professionals who support elected worker councils and help balance democratic participation with operational efficiency. IO psychologists work with council members on communication skills, problem-solving processes, and understanding business performance metrics, enabling more informed governance, or Cox, 2015. Equity, diversity, and inclusion through collective action. IO psychology has increasingly prioritized diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, yet rarely examines how collective bargaining advances these goals, particularly for historically marginalized workers. Evidence foundation. Research consistently demonstrates that union membership reduces racial and gender wage gaps and provides stronger protections against discrimination for workers from marginalized groups, Rosenfeld and Kleekamp, 2012. Unions have historically driven workplace equity policies including anti-discrimination contract language, diverse hiring commitments, and harassment grievance procedures. More recently, unions have championed criminal justice reform in hiring, inclusive benefits for LGBTQ+ workers, and accommodations for workers with disabilities. Effective approaches include coalition research on intersectional equity, partner with unions representing diverse memberships to study how collective bargaining affects equity outcomes across race, gender, disability, and other dimensions, producing evidence to inform both union strategy and management practice. Bias and discrimination intervention evaluation, assess whether individual-level diversity training or management-led inclusion initiatives produce comparable equity outcomes to collectively bargained protections and enforcement mechanisms. Organizing support for marginalized workers, recognize that workers facing discrimination often benefit most from collective representation and apply IO psychology expertise to support organizing campaigns in industries employing large numbers of women, people of color, and immigrant workers. Union democracy and internal representation, help unions themselves build inclusive governance structures that ensure diverse member voices shape bargaining priorities and organizational direction. Service Employees International Union, or SEIU, representing healthcare workers, janitors, and public employees, workforces disproportionately comprising women and workers of color, has partnered with researchers to document how collective bargaining addresses racial wage gaps and workplace discrimination. One multi-year study examined how SEIU contracts in healthcare included stronger anti-discrimination language, more robust harassment reporting procedures, and greater wage compression across racial groups compared to non-union facilities, contributing evidence that workplace equity interventions function differently when workers possess collective power versus when they depend on management discretion. Schmidt and Jones, 2013. Building long-term collaborative capacity. Isolated projects or individual partnerships, while valuable, will not fundamentally reshape the psychology labor relationship. Sustained transformation requires institutional changes addressing professional training, research infrastructure, ethical frameworks, and cross-disciplinary collaboration. Professional education and training reform. Most psychologists receive no formal exposure to labor relations, collective bargaining, or union contexts, leaving practitioners unprepared for the roughly 1 in 10 American workers who are union members, and the far larger number interested in representation. Essential reforms include graduate curriculum integration. Doctoral and master's programs should incorporate labor relations content covering historical context, legal frameworks, collective bargaining dynamics, and union structures. This need not require entire courses. Integration into existing coursework on organizational justice, employee voice, diversity, and employment law provides natural fit. Case discussions should routinely include unionized contexts, and research methods training should address access and ethical considerations when workers are collectively represented. Lohman, 2006. Fieldwork and internship diversification. Programs should actively create practicum placements with labor organizations, worker centers, neutral arbitration and mediation services, and labor management partnership programs. Student exposure to non-management perspectives during training can reshape assumptions about whose interests psychology serves. Continuing education offerings. Professional conferences and workshops should regularly feature labor relations content, collaborative case examples, and practical guidance for practitioners who encounter union contexts. The Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, or SIOP, could establish a labor relations practice area, create resource repositories, and sponsor symposia bringing together psychologists, industrial relations scholars, and labor practitioners. Interdisciplinary engagement. Psychology programs should build relationships with industrial relations, labor studies, and labor law faculties, creating opportunities for team teaching, joint research projects, and student cross-registration. Many universities house both psychology and industrial relations programs with minimal interaction, and institutional inefficiency with intellectual consequences. Research infrastructure and funding models. Management funding dominates psychology research, creating dependency that shapes question selection and theoretical framing. Diversifying research support would enable broader inquiry. Promising models include public interest research centers. Universities could establish centers focused on worker well-being and workplace democracy, funded through foundations, government grants, and diverse organizational partnerships, producing research not beholden to any single stakeholder perspective. The Center for Workplace Studies at Cornell University and the Uckler Institute for Research on Labor and Employment provide partial models, though both could expand psychological research components. Cochin, 2016. Data infrastructure for union research. Labor organizations rarely possess data systems or analytical capacity comparable to large corporations, creating research barriers. Philanthropic support could fund data platforms enabling unions to track membership experiences, test intervention effectiveness, and benchmark outcomes, analogous to how management associations support employer research. Participatory research funding. Grant-making organizations could require stakeholder participation in research design and governance as funding conditions, ensuring studies serve worker and union interests alongside academic and policy goals. The National Science Foundation's Program on Future of Work at the Human Technology Frontier provides one template, though it could more explicitly incorporate labor perspectives. A National Science Foundation, 2021. Unionized workplace research access. Many unions remain skeptical of researchers due to historical management bias. Building trust requires sustained engagement, transparency about research users, and demonstrated commitment to worker benefit. Research access agreements could formalize terms protecting worker privacy, ensuring result sharing, and specifying publication rights. Ethical frameworks for contested organizational contexts. IO Psychology's ethical codes address confidentiality, informed consent, and conflicts of interest but provide limited guidance for contexts where legitimate stakeholder interests conflict, precisely the situations unions make explicit. Enhanced ethical frameworks should address stakeholder identification and representation. When IO psychologists work in unionized settings or contexts with organizing activity, codes should require explicit identification of whom the psychologist represents. If contracted by management, practitioners should clarify whether they have duties to workers or unions, how worker data will be used, and whether interventions could affect bargaining dynamics. Transparency about positionality reduces perceived manipulation. Olefkowitz, 2008. Power asymmetry recognition. Ethical guidance should acknowledge that employment relationships involve power differences, making voluntary participation in management-sponsored interventions complicated. Codes should encourage practitioners to consider whether interventions empower or further subordinate workers and whether collective representation might better address identified problems than individual-level solutions. Neutral practice standards. For psychologists who work neutrally with both labor and management, as mediators, arbitrators, or partnership facilitators, codes should establish competency standards, conflict of interest protocols, and transparency requirements ensuring genuine neutrality rather than management bias disguised as neutrality. Justice and advocacy considerations. More fundamentally, IO psychology should engage long-standing debates about whether professionals have obligations beyond client service, whether psychologists should advocate for workplace justice even when doing so creates client tensions. Industrial relations scholarship on workplace rights and employment law's public policy dimensions suggests that some workplace issues transcend private contractual arrangements, raising questions about professional responsibility. Obad, 2004. Cross-disciplinary collaboration and knowledge integration. Industrial relations scholars have studied unions, collective bargaining, and workplace governance for decades, producing theoretical frameworks and empirical findings that IO psychology has largely ignored. Conversely, IO psychology offers methodological sophistication in individual and group processes that could enrich labor research. Productive integration requires joint research initiatives. Funding agencies and journals should actively solicit interdisciplinary collaborations examining questions at the intersection of individual psychology and collective institutions. How do psychological contracts shift in collectively bargained environments? How does union membership affect organizational identification and commitment? What individual differences predict union organizing support, and do these patterns suggest intervention opportunities? Theoretical synthesis. Scholars should develop integrative frameworks linking IO psychology constructs, or justice, voice, engagement, with industrial relations concepts, or bargaining power, union democracy, strike efficacy. Current theoretical separation creates artificial boundaries that obscure important dynamics. Publication venue expansion. IO psychologists should publish in industrial relations outlets, or Industrial and Labor Relations Review, British Journal of Industrial Relations, and vice versa. Journal editorial boards could include cross-disciplinary representation, and special issues could showcase integrative work. Shared language development. Disciplines develop specialized terminology that creates communication barriers. Deliberate efforts to translate concepts, identify equivalencies, and clarify distinctions would facilitate collaboration. For instance, IO psychology's organizational justice and industrial relations distributive conflict address related phenomena using different frameworks. Explicit mapping would clarify relationships and enable theoretical advancement. The International Labour Organization, ILO, and its research arm periodically convene multidisciplinary teams including psychologists, economists, sociologists, and legal scholars to examine work quality, social dialogue, and decent work. These collaborations, while sometimes challenging due to disciplinary differences, demonstrate that integration is feasible and produces richer analysis than single-discipline approaches. International Labour Organization, 2019. Conclusion. Industrial organizational psychology's century-long separation from organized labor represents a significant professional failing with accumulating costs. The field has limited its scientific scope, constrained its practical impact on worker well-being, and created ethical vulnerabilities by systematically aligning with management while claiming to serve employee interests. Bridging this divide will not occur through individual goodwill alone. It requires institutional reforms, curriculum changes that expose students to labor contexts, research infrastructure enabling non-management funded inquiry, ethical frameworks addressing power asymmetries and stakeholder conflicts, and cross-disciplinary collaborations integrating psychological and industrial relations scholarship. These changes demand acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the profession's history and confronting stakeholder interests that benefit from IO psychology's current positioning. The stakes extend beyond professional navel-gazing. American workers face intensifying economic precarity, eroding job quality, and diminishing voice in decisions shaping their working lives. These conditions produce the stress, burnout, disengagement, and health consequences that IO psychology documents but struggles to remedy through individual-level interventions. Collective representation offers institutional mechanisms addressing root causes, power asymmetries and governance deficits that no amount of resilience training or manager coaching will resolve. For IO psychology to credibly claim commitment to employee well-being and organizational effectiveness, it must engage the institutional structures through which workers have historically secured both. This means treating unions not as pathologies to explain or obstacles to manage but as legitimate stakeholder institutions deserving research attention, practice support, and collaborative partnership. The alternative is a profession that studies workplace democracy while ignoring its most developed forms, researches employee voice while excluding its collective expressions, and champions worker well-being while serving primarily those with power to hire psychologists. The path forward requires humility about past failures, openness to uncomfortable questions about whose interests the profession serves, and commitment to building relationships across long-standing divides. The rising generation of workers seeking collective representation offers an invitation, one that IO psychology can no longer afford to ignore.